All right. Looks like YouTube is just about coming online. Need to make sure that it's got everything ready to go. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I know I normally wait, but not tonight. I have a meeting at 7 and want to make sure that we have enough time for the topic as well as any questions. So last week we talked about the end of days, meaning the coming of Mashiach, the Messiah, Olam Haba, the world to come, and all of the amazing ideas that Judaism teaches us about that future realm into which we will all enter. However, tonight I want to shift the focus back to this world, what we call Olam Hazeh, this world. Now, that is in keeping with what I discussed last week, which is that Judaism's focus is on the nurturing of the soul and guiding it through the journey of this life, rather than fixating and obsessing about what comes next. And of course, when people are in this life, one of the most common things that they will experience is the loss of someone that they care about. And that will put them into mourning. And mourning, grieving for someone that is passed, is both a very personal and private activity, but in Judaism also a very public and guided activity. Yes, you will hear people often recount the aphorism that everybody grieves in their own way. And that is generally true in the sense that there is a lot of room for the different ways a person will express their grief and will need to find comfort. However, actually, there is a lot of commonality how most of us need to grieve. Many people may try to avoid those common points. Many people, especially in our modern contemporary culture, will try to do anything they can to avoid feelings of sadness as though they were somehow a sickness. And people will try to avoid dwelling too long on thoughts that make them unhappy, even when those thoughts are incredibly important to the memory of those that we care about. In Judaism, we have structured mourning in a way that allows us to pay honor to those that have passed, to pay honor to our own self and our own spirit as we guide ourselves through this grieving process, and to rely upon not only our traditions, but also our community. And as such, I have always found in my experiences that the Jewish practices surrounding mourning are among the healthiest and most impactful for people of all types, from all walks of life, from all origin, and in character. So, while still acknowledging that the individual will have their own needs within the framework of mourning as Judaism outlines it, let us dive into the general framework of mourning. As with all of these classes, this is meant to be a general introduction and not an exhaustive study. If we were going to study every point regarding mourning, we would need to run an entire few months worth of classes to really be able to even do it justice. But hopefully this will get you a broad enough idea that you'll understand the basic principles and mitzvot, commandments. And when it is necessary for you to know more, by all means, continue to study. And of course, contact me and I'll be happy to guide you with more detail when it is necessary. So the mourning process is divided up into different time periods, which guide us through different stages of grief. And yes, I know that sounds like a modern term, but really Judaism has recognized that there are stages for a very long time. And the first is Oninut. And Oninut is the time period between the passing of a loved one and the actual burial of that loved one. In the ancient world, and really even in the modern world of Israel, where the country is small and burial can be arranged according to Jewish practice quite quickly, this used to be a very narrow window, perhaps a few hours, maybe on to the next day. But that would really be the longest it might be delayed under most normal circumstances. Nowadays, in Western countries, in particular in the United States where I work, it can sometimes be a 2 or 3 day delay before the funeral can take place. and that on the Nut period, that grieving period, in that in-between moment can stretch on a little bit longer than is comfortable. And as we'll see, this period is marked by practices that work most effectively when it is a relatively short time. But before we get into all of those practices, I have to first define for you halachically, and according to Jewish law, who is required to mourn for whom. That is to say, we can all be saddened by the loss of a loved one. We can all be grieved by the loss of a friend. But when we are talking about the requirements of mourning, when we're talking about the mitzvot of mourning, there is a very clear nucleus, center circle of people for whom we are required to mourn. And those are our parents, meaning above us in our generation, our siblings, which are on the same level as us within our generation, and our spouses, which again are in our same level, and our children. If you were to imagine this as a family tree, it would be the branch you came from, the branches that came along with you, and the branches that are below you. Those are the only people for whom we are required to mourn. Now, it is often asked, well, could a grandchild undertake the formal and official mourning practices that we'll discuss for a grandparent? Could I undertake the different practices for a friend, for a coworker, for many other people? The short answer is yes, but, meaning that there is a reason why we are limited. One, because we do not wish to feel obligated to mourn for everyone that happens to touch our life. For if we were, then we would be in a constant state of mourning. And Judaism is not only interested in ensuring that we grieve, but also is interested in ensuring we do not over-grieve, meaning grieve forever and in perpetuity. Life is meant to be lived with joy and happiness alongside sadness. Sadness is not meant to be our permanent state, any more than joy is meant to be our permanent state. There is a time for both within our life. If we were to undertake mourning too casually for too many people, we would become a permanent mourner, and that is not appropriate. Secondly, oftentimes when people wish to mourn alongside of the required mourners, it can create friction. A grandchild that wishes to officially mourn, meaning following the halakha, the Jewish law for a grandparent, may sometimes come into a bit of a tension with their parents, the actual children of the deceased, who are obligated to mourn. For every parent will turn to provide comfort to their child, even when it's the parent that is feeling the loss most acutely for the loss of their actual mother or father. Now, in some cases, not everybody is interested, able, or willing to undertake all of the official mourning practices. In those circumstances, it can be arranged where somebody outside the immediate circle will be allowed to mourn on behalf of the family. But that should not be done casually. It should not be done without consulting the person that is the primary mourner, and really it should be done in discussion with your rabbi. Now, for the onen, the person that is mourning during that period between death and burial, there are a number of restrictions. We do not eat a substantial meal. We don't eat meat. We don't eat wine, both symbols of gladness. We do not say the Shema. We do not wear tefillin. And we are not obligated to fulfill the positive commandments, the thou shalt commandments. Also during this time period, we do not have marital relations with our spouse or anyone else. We do not bathe. We do not anoint. That means putting on fragrances, perfumes, things like that. We do not engage in joyful activities. This is not a time for playing games or watching movies. We do not get haircuts. We don't shave. We don't study Torah because it is considered joyous. And we don't go into work. We don't work at our occupations. So during this period between death and burial, you can see that everything really is shut down because, one, we are stunned by the loss of our loved one, and two, our primary focus and obsession must be the proper preparation of our loved one for burial. And there should be no other distraction, including other commandments, that prevent us from doing that in a complete and respectful way, and in a timely manner as well. So this period is a very intense moment. It is, like I said, a state of shock, and it is focused on helping somebody be laid to rest. Also during this time period, either at the moment of death, at the moment of hearing of the death, or at the funeral, depending upon the different traditions of different communities, we will engage in what is known as kriya. Kriya literally means tearing, and it is a mitzvah to tear our clothes for the loss of a loved one. If it is a parent, we tear on the left-hand side over the heart as a symbol of the connection that we share to them, for our heart only exists because of theirs. And on the right-hand side, we tear for all, everyone else that we are mourning. And this tear is worn throughout the Shiva period, the 7 days that we'll be talking about in just a second. Now, in the modern times, many people will not be able to easily tear their own clothing, and so they will often affix an additional piece of clothing, an additional cloth, and tear that in order to fulfill this mitzvah. That is fine, but the original is tearing the clothes, and indeed we see throughout the text of the Tanakh of the Bible that is the most common expression of mourning throughout all of the stories of grief. When we tear, we say a blessing that reads as follows: Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, dayan ha'emet, which means, as always, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who is the true judge. So we are blessing God for the justice of the world, knowing that the loss of this person, that they will still receive God's just and merciful care, and also, of course, that God will see the truth of their life and understand all that they were. Now, this tear can be stitched after Shiva, that is to say, after that 7-day period, and it can be completely repaired after Shloshim, which is the 30-day period. Again, we'll talk about those in a minute. However, for a parent, we never completely repair the stitch. Now, like I mentioned, in the modern world, most people are wearing a surrogate piece of cloth, so this is not usually as much of an issue. But in the ancient world, where people only had the clothes they wore, and usually only one set of clothes at that, when you could repair, and you could repair seamlessly, that was a very important thing. However, this means that for parents, the basting stitch, the rough stitch that you would make in your clothes, would leave a permanent scar on the outside of your clothing, as a way of reminding others and yourself of the loss that you have felt. The burial itself is handled as soon as possible. We believe that to delay the burial is considered disrespectful to the deceased. We should not make their piece wait simply because we're busy. Instead, we bury as quickly as possible. We can delay for the needs of safety. No one should go out and try and conduct a burial in the middle of a hurricane or a blizzard. We can also delay a burial for the imminent arrival of the primary mourners. If somebody is flying in from overseas, then yes, we can delay for a day or so in order to make sure they can be there for the burial of their loved one. However, we don't delay it in order to have a longer vacation or in order to finish up an important business deal. The delay is only for the honor of the deceased. At that time, we also give what is known as a hesped. It's a eulogy, and the eulogy can be given anywhere. Now, local customs will vary. It can be done at the graveside. It can be done in a memorial chapel. It can be done at a house. It can be done in a synagogue. Many different options are possible depending upon the local custom. I will say that here in Temple Israel, in Orlando, the usual custom is to do the eulogy either at the graveside or at the chapel that is located at the cemetery. The purpose of the eulogy is to remind ourselves of the person and their value and quality. Some people often wonder, do you tell all of the truth about a person in a way that might be disrespectful? And the answer is no. God knows who the person was, and that is ultimately what matters most. For us, we are acknowledging our loss, and as such, we focus on those aspects of the person and their life which make us grieve. This is not the time to settle old scores. This is not the time to attack their name or to besmirch them in public. We can certainly consider and discuss that in private, but during the funeral, during the eulogy, we are there to mourn, and as such, we will focus on those aspects that make us grieve the most. There is also a mitzvah to escort a person to their burial, what is known as levaya, and that escort can sometimes be done in a funeral procession in cars. Although here, again, usually in our congregation, it means that we will walk from the chapel to the burial site in the cemetery. We bury in this country in simple wooden coffins. In places like Israel, where they do not have that requirement, the person will simply be wrapped in burial shrouds. And we do not use any materials that would prevent the deceased from returning to the earth from which we were made. God crafted us from the soil, and whether you believe in a literal description of the creation of humanity as it might be understood from the beginning of the book of Genesis, or whether you believe that that is more metaphorical, what is certainly true is that we are made up of the stuff of this world. That is where our atoms came from. And as part of that cycle of our body and recognizing its material components, we return it to the earth to allow it to become part of the world again and to be transformed into whatever new shape and need that it is. This is one of the reasons why Judaism is implacably opposed to cremation. It is also why we do not believe in embalming or conducting autopsies, except where it is required by local laws. Once the burial is complete, we move our focus from the deceased to those that are mourning, to the mourners, to the grievers. And this happens during the first 7 days, to be called Shiva. Now, during Shiva, there are a number of different observances and commandments. So we'll focus on the primary commandments, and then I'll describe a few customs as well. So the first is to stay home, right? The act of Shiva is an act of isolation. It is staying home and not attending to any of the other activities that normally absorb our life during the normal week. This provides a space where we can focus on our grief, we can come to terms with our loss, and we can explore our memories and feelings. However, since we still have an obligation for tefillah, for prayer, it ends up by having the Shiva be at home for this entire 7 days, that other people will come to provide the community necessary for prayer, and as a not coincidental benefit, providing the support of a community as their presence will be there in the home. Also, during the 7-day period, we continue not to have haircuts and not to shave. We continue not to have marital relations, not to bathe, not to anoint, not to wear leather shoes, which are a sign of comfort and arrogance. We do not wear freshly pressed clothes, again, a sign of being dressed up. We don't have festive meals. We don't have purely social activities. And again, we do not engage in business. Now, for some people, especially in the modern world, unfortunately, they may feel that it is very hard for them to be able to take an entire week away from their employment. If you can, by any means, do so, I can guarantee that the process of Shiva is much more powerful and much more meaningful when you allow yourself the full week to mourn. If you cannot, do try, as our tradition says, to at least have the first 3 days of Shiva to allow yourself to grieve without the additional distractions of your employment. But 7 days really is the best. It is also customary to light a lamp or a candle, oil lamps in the ancient world, electric lamps if you can't have a candle, or a long-lasting candle in the modern world for the 7 days of Shiva. And it is also customary to cover mirrors in the residence, although this is not required. There are many different explanations for this particular custom. Many will point out that mirrors are usually used for preparing ourselves for a joyous activity or focusing on ourselves rather than our grief, meaning, primping and preening. And also there is a custom that checking oneself in the mirror would be a step towards preparing oneself for marital relations, which, as I mentioned, are not allowed during this time period. Now, just as there are requirements for those that grieve, there are also requirements for those who come to pay their respects and to provide support. The first thing that people are going to wonder is, what do I say to those that are grieving? And in all honesty, most times people will come up with things to say on their own, will often be clumsy and unhelpful. But don't worry, Judaism has you covered. There is an official phrase that we use as our opening extension of consolation to those that grieve, which is Hamakom Yenachem Etchem B'toch Sha'ar Avilei Tzion V'Yerushalayim. May the ever-present comfort you among the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. With this very short sentence, we accomplish so many things. First and foremost, we avoid saying anything that occurred to us that might be insensitive or offensive. However, the actual construction of this formula is also very insightful. First, we invoke God, Hamakom, as being one of the other titles that God wears, as a reminder that it is God that will bring comfort, not me, not someone else. It is ultimately God that will provide the avenue for comfort for those that mourn. I can be there as a conduit for God to help bring comfort, but I do not have the power to erase the grief that a person is feeling. Additionally, we recognize that comfort will come, that the grief that a person feels today is not the same grief that they will feel eventually. Eventually, the pain will diminish. We also remind them that they are not alone, not only because I am there saying this, but also because there are others. They are among the others that mourn. And by mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, we mean both those that mourn the destruction of Zion and Jerusalem as happened in the ancient days, but also among those that are members of Zion and Jerusalem, meaning the Jewish people, that are also mourning, that each person will at some point in their life have the burden of grief, and this person should not feel that they are completely unique in the pain that they feel. They are instead one of many that have gone through this experience. In fact, the person saying this phrase may have already grieved as well, and this is reminding them that they know honestly what it feels like, and they are there to offer any support that the mourner might need. But if you're not sure where to go from there, which again, most people are not, remember the teaching in Brachot, that the primary reward for attending a house of mourning is for the silence. You're not earning your good Jewish points by saying something other than the introduction phrase that was just mentioned. You are earning your good Jewish points by being there. Let the mourner guide the conversation. If they want to talk to you about their loved one, let them talk. If they want to sit in silence, let them sit. If they want to ask you about the news, talk to them about the news. Don't try to distract them. Don't try to entertain them. Don't try and make them smile. Just give them room to talk to you about whatever they need to say at that moment. And it will change from moment to moment. One time you visit, it might be that they wish to just cry. Next time they might wish to share a happy story. Another time they may wish to share something that they still feel guilty about. That's okay. Let them guide that conversation. Now, from the burial, this is an overlapping time. We have the first 7 days, what are called Shiva, which is the burial to Shiva, to 7 days. But burial to 30 days is also called Shloshim. Now, what I just said about Shiva, the first 7 days still applies for that. But for the remaining 23, there are continued restrictions as well. Again, we no longer, we do not have festival meals. We don't engage in purely social activities. This is not the time to go to a nightclub with someone, not the time to go to a movie, not the time even to go to someone else's birthday party celebration. We don't get haircuts, we don't shave, we still do not wear our freshly pressed clothes, and many choose to continue not to bathe, or if they do so, for the purposes of hygiene, they'll do so in cold water, basically trying to remind themselves that they should not be luxuriating during this time, even if they do need to continue to wash for the purposes of hygiene. However, a person is allowed to go back to work, and this is, they are allowed to leave the home and to do shopping and other regular activities. And this is the gradual reintroduction of the mourner into their life now, absent the person that has passed. Like I said, Judaism wants us to have that moment for intense grief, the onanut and then shiva, but it also wants us to begin to see our life even with the person no longer in it. So this blended time of shloshim, the remaining 23 days since burial after shiva has finished, sees lighter restrictions, but still restrictions to give us that gradual adaptation to our new situation. Now, that shloshim period, once it finishes, is the end of the formal mourning period for everyone except our parents. That is to say, whether it be a spouse, whether it be a sibling, whether it be a child, those first 30 days are the only 30 days that are required for mourning, for any of the practices that we have talked about, as well as for Kaddish, which we will talk about at the end. For our parents, we continue with some additional mourning practices for the first 365 days, for the first calendar year since their passing. I have noticed that in the modern world, many people are confused by this. 30 days doesn't seem enough to grieve for the loss of a spouse with whom you may have spent 60 years of your life. 30 days does not seem enough to grieve for a child that has been taken from you in your own lifetime. And I absolutely understand and agree. And that is partly because we are blessed in the modern world to have a limited number of deaths in our normal lifespan. However, the requirements as established by Judaism were established during a time, the ancient world, when death was a much more frequent occurrence. You would, by every statistical likelihood, bury at least one or two of your siblings during your lifetime. You would quite likely, but not guarantee, bury one of your spouses during your lifetime before remarrying, or be the spouse that died, and your surviving widow or widower would have to consider remarrying. And most painfully, most people would, unfortunately, experience the loss of multiple children during their lifetime. Disease, famine, drought, war. This took so many people in the early stages of life that mourning was a constant issue. If a person was to mourn for each of those people for a full year, they would quite likely spend a large portion of their life in mourning. And as such, Judaism does not want us to live our life in perpetual grief. It wants us to still be able to enjoy so much of what life has to offer, even though a loved one has passed. As such, the formal requirements for mourning are limited to 30 days for all except parents. Now, in the modern world, where death, thankfully, is a much less frequent companion, I certainly understand, and it is absolutely permissible for a person to extend the mourning for a loved one, for a spouse, for a child, up to the full year as they do for a parent. That is perfectly reasonable, given that it is a much less frequent problem. It is also perfectly reasonable to continue to mourn in the traditional manner only for those 30 days for our non-parents. Both responses to the modern world are perfectly fine. Usually it is best to discuss this with your rabbi in order to properly lay out how you will be grieving for the loss of these other people. But For the parent, it's not so much a choice. For a parent, we do mourn for the entirety of that calendar year from their death. And during that calendar year, we continue not to have any festive meals. This, again, is not a time to have a party at the house. This is not a time to be having a joyous, frivolous activity, which are perfectly fine for any other time of life. Right? It's absolutely fine to have a costume party just to celebrate a Tuesday when it is not part of the mourning time period. But during this year, we continue to limit it. People will avoid going to concerts or plays or movies or other things in order to mark that this year is indeed different. It is also customary to change your seat in the synagogue. That is to say, if you normally sit third row back, second seat in for every Shabbat, it is customary during this time period to show that you are unsettled, that you are shaken, to pick a different seat and to sit there. This is not a requirement, but for many people, it does provide them a change of perspective that allows them to feel different during the time. In the modern world, one of the most common and iconic practices of mourning is the recitation of the Kaddish. Now, the Kaddish is not technically a biblical practice, as it is written in Aramaic, a language which appears only infrequently in the Bible, in the Tanakh, except for the parts of the book of Daniel. And it is a custom that was instituted after the closure of the Bible. Indeed, it is a custom in its tight connection to mourning that was instituted even late into the rabbinic period. However, the Kaddish has become a cornerstone of our mourning practice for a number of reasons. Like I mentioned before, we would say Kaddish every day for most of our relatives, and we would say it for 11 months, sort of, will be explained, for a parent. That means that a person will attend services each day, and because Kaddish needs to be said with a minyan. Kaddish is one of those prayers, like the Kedusha or like the Baruch Hu, that requires the community structure, the community support, in order to be properly recited. And this forces those that mourn to seek out the company of others, which is incredibly important for the therapy of moving ourselves through grief. It is also a way to create a daily reminder for 30 days or for almost a year of the loved one, in order to not hide from our grief, but allow it to continue to mature throughout that time and eventually become a more reflective memory of the person for who they were, rather than dwelling only on the pain of their loss. But why? And what does this custom mean in the modern world? Well, there is an understanding that Kaddish has something to do with the rectification of a person's situation in their judgment before Adonai. As we talked about last week in discussing the afterlife, we believe that each person will be judged before God. And from our perspective, at least, since time works differently in Olam Haba, the world to come, the period after death for the first 12 months is a period of judgment. We, the living, wish to perform mitzvot on their behalf, to their honor. They can no longer, as we talked about last week, and we can. By doing so, we are showing that their life, their influence has left a lasting impact of good in this world. We are, in a sense, testifying on their behalf before the judge, before the court, to say, look at what this person achieved, not only in their life, but in the effect on my life. And I can show you what they did by doing things in their honor, in their name. Now, since parents have the greatest impact on us and who we are, and they are the people for whom we have the greatest respect, we recite Kaddish on their behalf for that whole time of judgment. However, as no one wishes to imply that their parents need all 12 months of help, most communities traditionally will end Kaddish at the 11-month mark. Essentially saying, I'm going to give almost all the help I could possibly give as testifying to their goodness, but I'm not going to give so much as that would imply that they were actually among the worst. So we traditionally will stop at 11 months. If a person wishes to go through the whole 12, that's perfectly fine. There was no prohibition for doing so. Although understand that because of this custom of finishing at 11 in a community, it may give the wrong impression of your feeling or attitude towards a parent if you recited Kaddish for 12 months. Come on, there we are. Now, the Kaddish is also seen as a central statement of faith. Famously, it does not talk about death in and of itself during this time period of recitation. However, since it requires a minyan, 10 Jewish adults, it means that we are declaring God's greatness publicly. And since the congregation also has a role to play by responding to the statements of the leader, it is a way of showing that we are leading them towards that recognition of God's greatness. And personally, emotionally, psychologically, it is absolutely essential and very powerful to hear the response of the community. It is one reason why I have tried to continually remind the congregation that mourners' Kaddish, Kaddish Yatom, may be said by the mourners, but it must be responded to by the congregation. They need to hear our voice in order to feel the full effect of this practice. The Kaddish also forces us to be with other people rather than to be alone. Again, it cannot be recited in private. It demands us to also confront our feelings about God. Many people are often upset with God, confused, angry, and by reciting the Kaddish daily, it gives us a chance to continue to update those feelings, to work through them, and eventually recognize that God is still with us through our pain rather than the source of it. And as always, participation in daily prayer and reflection is essential and very vital at any time, all the more so during the time of grief. There is also in Judaism a custom that we call yahrzeit. And this is an ongoing practice that remains with us for the rest of our life. Yahrzeit is a 1-year marking. In fact, it is an annual marking of the passing of our loved one. So that means that on the anniversary of their passing or burial for the first year, we will not only light a candle that will burn throughout the day, but we will also make a special effort to be able to say Kaddish together with the community. And this is a practice that will happen on the anniversary of a person's passing for the rest of the mourner's life. So somebody that loses a parent will be saying Kaddish and lighting a candle on the yahrzeit, on the anniversary of that passing, for their own remaining years. And this is a beautiful way of remembering a person that has passed. It is also a beautiful way of continuing to see how the feelings about their passage will evolve. It is also a beautiful way of holding on to those memories, of pulling them out and considering them again more deeply. The yahrzeit, in fact, is something that is so significant that even in earlier days of Judaism, where we didn't have good record keeping for the birthdays of many people, we often do have good records for the yahrzeit of many of the important people in the past. We will still keep the record, and you can find calendars that have the list of the yahrzeits of many of the famous Jewish leaders, rabbis, or other contributors to our culture that are scattered around the calendar as a reminder of the passage of many of these great luminaries from our midst. So yahrzeit provides a very good reminder. It also provides a very good limit. By reminding ourselves that we will have a yahrzeit, this anniversary reminder, it means that we can try to bundle any reawakening of that grief after the initial 30 days or year worth of mourning to that yahrzeit day. Yes, it will be hard to remember that they are gone on that day with acute awareness, but it also helps us focus on that day to have those feelings rather than allowing it to be a constant feeling for the rest of the year as well. So just as we would not celebrate our birthday every day of the year, because to do so would be rather egotistical and self-centered, so too we don't celebrate or commemorate the loss of a person every day, because that too would also be detrimental, as it would cause us to grieve over much. All right, that is the end of the official slides. Like I said, this is really an add-on, an addition to our discussion from last week. And like I also mentioned, this is only the briefest outline of of how we mourn in Judaism. If you have more questions, please study and please be in touch. If anyone has additional questions right now, by all means, feel free to fire off in YouTube in the chat or online through Zoom. But I'm not seeing anything at the moment. So I think we will leave it there for tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.